Welcome, everybody, to this episode of the RLM podcast. I'm your host, Eli Detter, and today our discussion is going to be centered around books, and who better to do that with than a librarian? So, we are introducing the high school librarian for Hempfield High School, Mrs. DeMaria. Mrs. DeMaria, please feel free to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I absolutely love podcasting. I said to Eli, hand me a microphone and I won't stop. So, at any point in time, you can just cut me off today, Eli.
All right. Well, as I said, Ms. Deemer, you have a pretty impressive resume, so to speak. Would you just like to share with everyone exactly all the stuff you've accomplished?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I actually started out as an English teacher, high school English teacher. And as part of my studies, I went to graduate school and I got an instructional technology degree. And then was working a lot with the library and the librarians here on certain projects, including technology. I absolutely love the integration that the librarians provided me. So I actually got mentored by a former high school librarian who essentially rose me up as a librarian, helped me get into graduate program to go to school. And I absolutely fell in love with this profession. So now I am a K-6 school librarian and I'm very active in our local association. So I'm actually the president-elect of Pennsylvania School Librarians Association. And I've served as their executive director prior to that. And I'm currently the co chair for the Advocacy Committee. So I do a ton of work outside of just the school day and inside of the school building to advocate for school libraries, for school library programs, for school librarians. And of course, at the center of all of that is our students.
Yeah, absolutely. Very impressive. Lots of connections there. Um, obviously, obviously, librarian it encompasses more than just books. It encompasses allowing. I mean, I guess you would have a better explanation of what a real librarian is.
Yeah, I mean, of course we love books, but gone are the days where you think of a librarian just sitting here stamping books out to students. Actually, my fabulous aides handle most of that work, but there's a lot of facets of being a school librarian. My favorite is teaching, actually. So we collaborate with other classroom teachers at the secondary level, and in elementary schools, of course, you have a library class. So
Right.
we have a curriculum that we cover, and we are a huge part of teaching the research standards in our Pennsylvania Common
Yeah.
Core standards. So I'm absolutely the best days that I have as a librarian are when I'm in the classroom teaching students how to access
Right.
materials, how to find reliable materials, and because I have that English background, I work really well with the English
Right.
teachers.
You were an English teacher before you were a
Yeah, yeah.
librarian.
So we actually collaborate on the research papers
Right.
themselves
Yeah.
and figure out the structure, and I'm really proud of that work, and
Yeah.
I can't imagine students not getting that. So I feel bad for students that don't have school librarians that help them like that.
Yeah.
But other parts of my job include managing the collection, so getting rid of old books that are no longer relevant, ordering new and popular books, and a variety of different viewpoints for students. Just making sure that we have what you want to read,
Yeah.
and then moving things around so that it's accessible and easy, and of course creating a welcoming and inclusive environment.
Yeah.
Just recently, Eli's seen it, but you're all listening at the moment. We, me and my staff, we created a what I call an aesthetic library. So we took away old books, cleared some shelves, and put out some unique old books, and just for display, and some colorful posters and signs and knickknacks, and just created this like really neat, warm space.
Yeah.
So that's something I'm just particularly proud of that just happened recently.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. And I would say the the Hempfield High School Library definitely has a very wide variety, very multiple different genres, multiple awesome authors that are thrown in there. Of course, I tend to gear more towards the thriller, some of the supernatural and romance novels myself. Those are
Yeah.
kind of my favorite. What is like your favorite genre, or the genre that you tend to read most
Uh,
other than others?
Good. I love that question. I was gonna preface this whole conversation, Eli, with "Don't you dare ever ask a librarian what their favorite book is." It's not possible, but yeah, let's talk about. Let's break it down a little bit. So I would say I taught elementary library for about 10 years. So I just recently returned back to the high school, and that's actually really grew me as a reader. Before coming back to the high school and digging into this collection, I would say I was purely realistic fiction. Like you
Oh,
won't
wow.
catch me straying from realistic fiction, and I think we're going to talk about why in a little
Yeah,
bit.
yeah,
And that's fine. So I'll let that conversation for a moment. But since coming back and then working with our fabulous classes that we have sci-fi and dystopian lit classes. We have sports literature. We have a resilience class, modern American voices of resilience. It's really helped kind of branch me out into different genres. We also have a mystery, suspense, and horror class for literature, and so I would say sci-fi is the one that kind of really pushed
yeah.
me out of my comfort zone. I've read a lot of sci-fi and
Oh, yeah.
dystopian in the last year, so that's really been exciting, and I love recommending those titles then to students and authors. Also, like you, like suspense. Like
Yeah,
I
yeah.
love our thriller section, our
Yeah,
mystery section. Those two kind of go hand in hand to build that like suspense
yeah,
genre. I would
absolutely.
say so. I've been reading a ton of that as well. So yeah, I guess I can no longer say like I have a one favorite.
Yeah.
I love fiction. There was a long time I read just nonfiction.
Yeah, I never, I can nonfiction is like unless I'm reading it for something very specific, like I need to know this very specific fact, I really won't touch nonfiction. I'm more of a using my imagination, so some of that will fall into romance or dystopian or sci-fi, but those three tend to be centered around where my favorite. Realistic fiction, I like it, but I don't know. I can never tell what's realistic fiction, what isn't. I'm like, because realistic fiction and romance, those are always very closely intertwined. People tend to
Yeah.
mix those up, and which is great. I love it when, you're reading something and you get a little bit of, sci-fi, a little bit of romance, a little bit of thriller in it. It's just kind of everything coming together in one book, which is great.
Yeah, I mean, definitely there's certain books that span more than one
Yeah.
genre. I do want to pop in there and say something about nonfiction. We have a pop nonfiction section, so you'd be surprised. You said that you prefer fiction.
Mm.
Just if there's stuff out there that interests you, I'm really interested in the past couple years in eating really clean and very much trying to understand how our food is
Right.
evolved and how processed food affects our bodies. And so I've read a lot of nonfiction on that. But we have this popular nonfiction section which pulls out things like global warming, climate control, like things that are important to you as a
Right.
student. And these are like new publications, and we put them in that section so they're more accessible. Students also really like memoirs and nonfiction, poetry. So
Yeah.
certainly I just, as a librarian, I'm always quick to be like, hey, you said you don't like this genre, but let me see if I can sell you something in it. I'm
I
kind of a
don't
salesperson with ideas.
I don't know if it's that I don't like it. I think I just tend to I do not that is not the first type of book that I look for when I go into a library. When I
Sure.
go into a library, I look towards the sci-fi and dystopian. It's just because I like stuff that isn't real when I'm reading. I
Yeah.
like,
It's an escape.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's that absolutely, and that's again something I want to talk about how books and the way that some people use them. Some people use them to relate to things that happen in everyday life, and some people use them as an escape from things that happen in everyday life. Which, I mean, I understand. I mean, books in and of themselves, all essentially, unless they're just a fact, like a factoid book, they're all books with stories, books that have, and all stories have a moral, have a meaning to them,
Mhm.
and I think that's really why, for people like you and me, why we look at books, we read books, and we can gain this knowledge from it, not just of the plot from the book or what they're the characters from the book, but we also gain a knowledge of how the book portrays certain aspects of how people react in real life to certain situations.
Yeah, absolutely. You want me to talk about that a
Yeah,
little bit?
absolutely. Totally.
Sure. Yeah. So, in our profession, we have something called, or we use a model called windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. So we want to make sure that our collections have windows for our students to see new perspectives, and to just be made aware that there's something outside of their window.
Right.
The mirrors are especially important. We want to have literature, both fiction and nonfiction, that reflects our students so
Yeah.
that they can see themselves in books and relate to the characters that are in these books. And then sliding glass doors, is exactly what you're talking about. Like, open the door. Let's step out into a new adventure. Again, different perspectives, and an avenue to get there, right? So
Yeah.
it's all
Yeah.
accessible to students. But I'm going to go ahead and kind of, I spoiler alert it earlier, talking about realistic fiction. As an educator, I care deeply for this age group, and I really love working with teens, um, especially being a librarian, because we all come from varied background
Right.
and truth,
Absolutely.
and so, what I love about young adult fiction is, and what a lot of people don't understand, is that young adult fiction is a type of fiction, and it is written by authors for your audience, for young
Right.
adults. And it is written in a perspective that usually has an adolescent or a teenage protagonist going through something, right?
Right.
Every
Absolutely. Yeah.
every book has a
Yeah.
conflict. Otherwise, it wouldn't be very interesting to read. So there's something that happens with this adolescent protagonist, and especially why I liked realistic fiction is I love to read the teenage character,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And I very much still see myself in that age group. It was an impressionable time on me,
Right.
and it really formed me as a person. And I maybe never let it go.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when I read an author that does a really good young adult, adolescent
Yeah.
protagonist, like, I just feel like, oh my gosh, I felt like that in my life. And
Yeah.
guess what? If I felt it as a boring old adult at this point, I guarantee that my students have felt it
Yeah.
or are feeling it. So I love that genre, but and now I've ventured out into
Yeah.
different genres,
Yeah.
and I've seen it, but that one's always going to be really close to my heart because I feel like I needed books as a
Yeah.
teen, to kind of help me process what I'm going through. And you know, this age group is particularly important, and I don't know that that. Like,
Right.
teenagers are so important because you aren't done growing,
Yeah.
right? So you kind of have this, like, your brains aren't completely formed. You have like a little bit less of a filter,
Yeah.
right? And I see that as a really positive thing. And I
We have
think
we have more to learn.
right, absolutely you do, but at the same time, that lack of filter, or lack of your brain being completely formed and
Right.
kind of closed off in the adult sense, is that you're super creative and you have all of these talents, and you're not afraid to take risks with those
Right.
talents, as well as you have these good ideas that a lot of times adults just aren't capable of thinking because their brains are done formulating, and they're closed off, and we're filtered, and we're jaded to a certain extent. So I find that, I mean, I really trust teenagers' intuition, and I feel like I want the library to be a place where they can find experiences and characters and
Right.
literature that's just going to help them in that
Yeah.
sense. So, I think I lost my way on the thought, but I really enjoy working with this age group, and I want literature that they're going to enjoy, and so I often read with that kind of frame, that lens, I
Yeah.
guess, that I'm looking for more literature that's going to
Yeah.
feed that soul of
Right.
of the teens that are in my library.
Yeah. And there's always that, again, like you said, that's the one thing that I love about realistic fiction is that it doesn't go so far out of the boundaries of realistic. What am I trying to say? Of course, obviously, the stories aren't real, but it stays inside that barrier of real world um, occurrences, real world situations.
Right.
Something that happens in that book, and you're like, yeah, that's happened to me in real life, or that could very easily happen to anybody in real life, which helps us to then, we read the book, we read how the characters, or even in movies, how the actors, how the people in the movie deal with that situation.
Right.
And in some cases, it almost makes us look and be like, huh, what if we just decided to treat the situation like that, like they did? Would that work the same for us? And it kickstarts the gears, gets you to start thinking, and gets you to start, using problem solving and all that critical thinking stuff. And that's one thing that I appreciate the most of books is that it forces you to think.
Yeah. Well, you actually helped me get my thought back because I was digressing a little bit there, right? So
Yeah.
I was saying that I like so appreciate that you're creative and open and you have no filter, right? Well, that has good and bad
Right.
consequences,
Right.
right? So it is age appropriate, or developmentally appropriate, for high schoolers to want to push boundaries, right? But there's
Right.
all these like societal bumpers in the way, like,
Yeah.
you've got your teachers keeping you in line. There's things you can and can't do in this building.
Right.
um, and so what happens is it's natural for you to want to push these boundaries or to explore things or to test the waters per
Yeah.
se,
Yeah.
right? And it's not safe sometimes because of the
Yeah.
consequences, right?
Yeah.
So that's when that fiction comes handy,
Right.
right? Because those YA books, they can be edgy, they can push boundaries,
Yeah.
right? And like you said though, then your protagonist has a consequence.
Right.
And
Right.
there's like a moral of the story, right?
Yeah.
You'd be hard pressed to find a lot of books in YA realistic fiction that the protagonist is going to make a terrible mistake and be rewarded for it
Yeah.
later, right?
Yeah.
So essentially, these books allow you, this age group of books, these YA books, they allow my teens to push those boundaries in a safe manner
Right.
inside a book. And then you see with the protagonist consequences or how they problem solved it. And like you
Right.
said, you take that and you're like, think about it. You process through it. Books help students process
Yeah.
situations, whether they've happened or not. But
Yeah. And I was gonna say, and I think um it works even better because all, like you said, all the realistic fiction, young adult fiction books, they lead you down that path of you're given a character to focus on, right? The main character, protagonist. Usually, the first character that you're introduced to is the protagonist.
Mhm.
You lead them down. They go through a bunch of trials and whatever. They make a choice, and sometime down the line, they're obviously, like you said, they're going to face some sort of problem or consequence from that choice. And I think right there it helps. Also, I think it almost helps people that when teens such as myself are deciding to make a choice like that, and we can just, like it in the books show us, you know,
Mhm.
and if we're able to comprehend what the books are showing us, we can go through our head, go through down that line, and be like, huh. So if I do this, potentially sometime down the line, there's going to be a consequence. Now, you may not always know what that consequence is going to be, which is sometimes part of the fun in taking the risk is you don't know what's going to happen, so you try it. But if it's something that you can definitely be like, I know the consequence is going to be it's not going to be a positive consequence.
Well, it depends on your choice, I
Right,
guess,
right.
right?
If you do something and you're like, well, I can definitely know that later down the line, this consequence is not going to be a positive one. That's when you use those critical thinking skills. You use the problem solving, all that stuff, and that's something that I look for in books. I look for books that kind of challenge the reader while they're reading them. So they're like, um, they're questioning sometimes why the main character made this choice instead of that choice. And they're like, well, why didn't they just do that? That was obviously the clear choice. And then that book almost shows you all the thoughts and all the stuff that goes into making that choice. And it helps you be like, okay, so I understand that. I can either, and then you have the choice of either choosing to learn from it or just being like, oh, okay, whatever. And, just continue down whatever path you want to go down.
Yeah. And I mean, character development is huge for me and what I love. I love when I read a book and I think about the character and I almost feel like they're a real person.
Yeah,
You know what I
yeah,
mean? Like that's when I know the author's done a really good job at that. But yeah, I always tell my students like I would much rather you push a boundary in a book and read the book and see what the protagonist's consequences are than you to do it in real life.
right,
It's
right,
it's essentially giving you a safe place to naturally explore your developmentally appropriate, you know, time in your life.
right, right. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I almost, like you said, I do that. I do that with like anything. Whenever I'm reading a book or whenever I'm watching a TV show, if I can I mean, TV shows almost even more are those are realistic because I mean you're watching it happen instead of just reading a book and having to imagine in your head. So with a TV show, it's almost like you see it, you see you see the options the person could take. They take one option, you're like, oh well, you could have done this, you could have done that, whatever. You keep going down. They keep showing you what happens because of maybe uh, one decision that he or she made years ago, or even a second ago, and then it's almost like whenever I watch it, I'm like, okay, if I can watch this and I'm seeing how this character is developing, seeing how this character evolves throughout even a couple, a couple span of minutes, just how they act, that is usually how I judge books, like how I judge books, TV shows. If I can look at the character and I like the envision or the imagination that leads me to, that's when I get really into the book, really into the plot. That's when I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like the greatest book ever. And I read it and I go through, I'm like, wow, that absolutely changed how I think about everything. So I almost, whenever I love how books are able to leave that impression on you, just the impression in your mind, like, because you read that book and then maybe you go do something that was very similar to what happened in the book or whatever, and you're like, huh, so I know the options I can choose. Now the book isn't necessarily what's destined to happen if I make this option, but still I do know, maybe more likely than not, there is a positive or there is a negative consequence for this action, and then that's where you make your decision. And some people will just make the wrong decision just to see what happens, just to kind of poke the bear. Um, I don't know. I would say I'm going to take the uh, path of least resistance for the most
Mhm.
time. I
Yeah, and
don't know.
like you said, sometimes books are just fun to read, and the
Yeah.
characters are just fun to be
Yeah.
around and hang with, and it has no impact per se on your life in particular. And some of it is just seeing different
Right.
perspectives,
Yeah.
stuff that may never happen to you
Yeah.
because of choices you won't make. But nonetheless, it's just good to know that you might meet another human being that has been through something
Yeah.
that you've explored in a book.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Just good to make yourself well rounded.
Yeah. As I had told you before, I kind of wanted to delve into how, obviously, like we've been talking about, realistic fiction is the best, in my opinion. It's the best, or not necessarily just realistic fiction, but anything that can relate to situations that do occur in real life. I think. I mean, I know that I use books and I read the books, and whenever I find something that's similar to something I've done or something that I've
Hmm.
witnessed or whatever, I I almost just delve deeper into that book because I'm like, well, how did they figure this out, right? How did they
Hmm.
go about in their universe? How do they go about this stuff? So I just want to talk about how do the books, the characters that we read, how does that, how do you think that influences the way teenagers or even adults or whatever little kids how they choose to act in real life?
I can't say that like books in particular maybe change our
Right,
actions, but like as you
right.
said,
They
they
influence it.
influence, right? Sure. Um, I don't know that I have a great answer for that. I just so maybe I could tell you a like an anecdotal. So, this year I read a lot of Asian American literature. No particular reason. I just read one and then sort of became aware of another, and I probably read six or seven.
Hmm.
Um, and again, I have Asian American students, and so and not that I would walk up and say, "Hey, I read this in a book. Is that true?" But I think it just made me a more understanding individual of especially if they have immigrated. I've read stories about that, or about family culture, or relationships between mothers and daughters in Asian American culture. So it helped me just have better perspective of someone outside of myself. You know
Right,
what I mean? Like
right.
that weird mirror, not the mirror. Sorry, excuse me. The window or the sliding glass door. And so I think the collective of what you read does shape you to a certain extent.
Yeah,
To have empathy, to have an understanding of the world that's out there. It really does help you to shape that world, and books make it more broad, right?
Right.
So the more, I only gave you one example, but the more broad reading that you're doing, the more that you're getting to different perspectives and things you hadn't considered before. I think that that shapes the way that your world can look
Right.
and the way that you can visualize, your path. And certainly, I think, obviously, I'm a little biased, but I think that the more you read, the broader your views are,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I would agree with that. Yeah. I've been reading books since I don't know, since I was probably 4 or 5 years old. And back then, I would read pretty much everything I could get my hands on and understand. I mean, I was reading the dictionary and just sitting there flipping through, reading the entire word, trying to figure out what the weird symbols were, which I now know are phonetic spelling,
Yeah.
and then just reading definitions. And that's how that's how I grew my vocabulary, and two, that's how I grew my. I mean, that's how you figure out comprehension when you're reading something, and you're like, well, what does this mean? And then you have that random knowledge that you for some reason decided to absorb and
Hmm.
you use that later in life. But I've I have used books as an escape from stuff that was actually happening, whether it's just because I didn't, I just didn't like it. I was just like, I'm just going to read a book and try and forget about what's happening.
Sure. Yeah.
And I don't think it's a bad thing for people to use books that way. But I do think that if we continue to only I guess it's if we only use books as an escape from the world or from people or whatever, if we only use books as an escape, we're not going to glean anything that these books are offering to us, right? Like if all I do is just read I don't know, if all I use a Stephen King novel is just because I don't feel like dealing with whatever's going on,
Hmm.
I'm not going to gain any of the knowledge, any of the morals from the book. I'm not going to gain anything. I'm just going to be reading a book, and me reading that book isn't going to serve any purpose.
Oh, I would disagree with that completely. I mean, you still have your character
Right.
development. You still have your processing your consequences. You know what I mean? I think that's in every type of
Yeah.
literature.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. I mean, you and I want to speak. I actually want to like drop back for a second and call you a little bit of an anomaly because I don't because you love reading
Yeah.
obviously,
Yeah.
but I have a ton of students that don't that they would consider themselves an unmotivated reader, right? So. Even in that, I just try my best to give them some formats that work for them. I just want to talk for a second about my favorite author. I don't know if that was on your list to
No, you're
ask,
good. Yeah. Go
but
ahead.
my favorite author is A.S. King, Amy Sarah King. She writes middle grade books under Amy Sarah King, and then A.S. King is her young adults, and she's my favorite author because she writes um, magical realism in many
Mm,
cases, some historical fiction too, and a touch of sci-fi with her
nice.
one book switch. But what I love about her is, regardless of the genre she's writing, her teen, her adolescent
Right.
protagonist, like it just hits every single time, and it doesn't matter um, if it's a male or a female. Um, it just I feel like I can totally identify with that protagonist,
Mm,
and I just I share her so often because I want others to be
right.
able to cling to
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah.
Um, but in any case, she just won her second Prince. What's so cool about this Prince, and I promise I'll get to the point, is that it is for Prince is for the best YA literature of the year. It is for a short story collection.
Mm,
So, talking about an unmotivated reader, last year, one of my goals for the library was I took all the old canon, like the um, old dead white guys. I hate to say that, but that's a common term that's used. The really classic kind of
right.
short
Right.
story stuff. And I moved it to classics, right? I'm not getting rid of it. Like,
Right.
don't, no one, I don't want anyone to get upset here. Like, I still have it, it's still on the shelf. The Whitman's still there. Don't worry. But I cleared it out for a reason. I put all modern contemporary short story collections in the short story collection area. So this is called short form fiction. And so this Prince that A.S. King just got last week actually was for a book called The Collectors, and
Hmm.
she asked other authors, her friends, to write a story, and the whole just theme of the book was collecting. Like,
Hmm.
so
Right.
we're collecting stories here. It's a fascinating, so it's like a novel size, but every chapter is a short
Oh,
story.
nice.
And it's by different authors. Short story collections can be by one author or several
Right.
authors.
Right.
Sometimes the stories have a similar character throughout, like there's a thread
Yeah.
of, or they can just be completely different. And this one in particular has fiction and nonfiction and some drawings as well. So I wanted to hit two birds with one stone here. One, that's a way for me to try to reach my students. Okay, hey, look, I hear that you don't feel like you're a good reader, you're not a motivated reader,
Hmm.
you don't care for it. Let's try this, right?
Yeah.
It's really motivating to read in a short span of time a whole story. You get the big beginning, the middle, the end. You get that character
Yeah.
development. All the things that you and I love about it. You get it in a shorter punch.
Right. Right.
So I also really like to recommend audiobooks. I'm like such an audiobook freak. It is reading. Like,
Yeah.
let me just disclaimer. It is still reading. You're
Yeah.
still getting every bit of what literature
Absolutely.
does for you. And I myself my own child has dyslexia. So reading can be a challenge.
Right.
Speaking of, so audiobooks are great for that. But speaking of like graphic novels and manga,
Yeah.
again, another accessible way for students to feel like they can be successful
Right.
readers. So,
Absolutely.
what's my point in all that? I don't know. I just really like being a librarian,
Yeah.
and I want everybody to enjoy it like we do. So
Yeah.
I really try my hardest to have every little facet that just could reach that
Yeah.
one student.
Yeah. I need to start getting back into reading. I was getting like 4 or 5 books every week last year, but it was awesome. I always I I think I read most, if not all, of the realistic fiction romance books last year, and I loved every single one of them because I love the. I mean, they all had different formats. Not all of them are the same, but I still love just the way they're written. I love all the authors are amazing. Of course, I've told you this, that the favorite series that I've read in recent time was the Shatter Me series.
Hmm.
It's just the character development, the storyline, it all works together great, and it's a pretty big series. I mean, it's 5 or 6 novels plus the little novellas,
Hmm.
which just even add even more. And I didn't know that the novellas existed until after I'd read all the books, and I was like, oh, what is this 1.5? So I went back, read it, and I was like, that just made everything just fall right back into order, which was great. But
Yeah. My favorite book of 2023, because I read 63 books in 2023, was All My Rage by Saba Tahir. So that was like the one that just hit so hard. It kind of falls in line with that, like strong resilience of a character.
right,
They were situations in the book that I would have never personally gone through as a teenager, but again, just give me that perspective, like,
right.
wow, this kid is really stuck, man. Like his mom is dead, and he's trying to hang on to his family's business, and the method of which he went to go through that, it was untraditional, and obviously I hope none of my students face these kind of things, but they might,
Right.
and
Yeah.
so I'm always reading with that lens in mind. But that book really got me. It
Yeah.
clutched my heart. It stuck with me.
Yeah. I think that yeah, that's my favorite. Maybe I don't know, maybe favorite isn't the word. That's the thing I value the most in books is when you get to that spot where it just, it just hits you right in the heart and you're like, "Wow."
Yeah.
It just sets everything in a awesome new perspective, which is really why I read books because I want a new better perspective on the world and what, things that go on. So,
All right. Well, we're running low on time.
yeah.
Is there anything else you wanted to ask? I don't know if you got through all your questions or not.
I don't know. Okay, last question. Um, what is out of any book that you've ever read, what was like the most uh the one quote or the one message or the one moral of the story that like hit you the absolute hardest? Like you read it and you were just like, mind blown from it.
I think talking about, you know, how we were talking about like the suspense genre,
Right.
you know, like that thrillers or that mystery. Um, I'm not sure if I have a book in particular. I mean, I hate to say it, but One of Us is Lying was really one of the best like twists at the end of the book. And so I think that those type of books stick with me
Right.
more because I'm like, whoa, I didn't see that coming. And I totally wish that I could read this whole book all over
Right.
again
Yeah.
and like not know that ending. You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Yeah.
So again, I told you can't ever ask a librarian her favorite book, so I don't have a particular quote. But I think that in general, that kind of
Yeah.
genre kind of hits you, where you're like, oh my gosh, I just totally didn't see that coming. So
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. I. Yeah. I don't. I. I think I'm slowly getting more into the genre of those. Um. The kind of the really motivational, the self improvement. Like I need to start getting into that genre because I'm at the point in my life
it's
where that stuff.
nonfiction, though.
I know, but I gotta get
Yeah,
I
see,
gotta get
I
into
told
it.
you.
I gotta
I
get
know.
into it.
You
Gotta
like
start reading it.
nonfiction more than you think you do.
I
Yeah.
probably do. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Atomic Habits is a really good one to start with there. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you everybody for listening. Ms. DeMaria, thank you for coming on and agreeing to be a part of the podcast. You guys can find this episode on YouTube, Spotify, Radio Public, Overcast, iHeartRadio, plenty of other websites and apps. Um, Obviously, you can find us online on Instagram, RLM Podcast. Type it in, you'll find us. Our link, our super link to everything else is in our bio. So feel free to start reading some books that we mentioned. Um, Obviously, those of you who go to Hempfield High School, we have a wide variety of books. Feel free to check them out. And for those of you who do not go to Hempfield, who don't even go to school anymore, we suggest that you start reading some books.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.